Hello.
Hello there. Okay, I can see you better.
Great.
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Good, thank you. Thank you so much for joining me today. You do so much. You write your newsletter, you advise companies, and you obviously run GTM and Ops at Keystone AI. I want to leave the room for you to intro yourself if you'd like to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for having me on first and foremost. I'm the head of revenue operations at Keystone AI. We are an economic consulting firm, plus we provide an AI incubator internally where we're targeting discrete manufacturers and solving some major supply chain issues. In addition to that, I run, I guess what folks would call a side hustle, a content business targeting the revenue operations persona. And the content that I release is in the form of a podcast, a Substack newsletter, and digital courses.
Okay, quick tangent. On your LinkedIn, you list your role as GTM and Ops instead of Revenue Ops. Is that just because semantically GTM is more recognizable?
Well, GTM is more expansive than revenue operations, in my professional opinion. So, GTM includes working with product and much of the go-to-market strategy. So, when you think about revenue operations, you're thinking about solving for alignment across the traditional go-to-market functions such as marketing, sales, customer success. There's also maybe a semantic or syntactical difference. Go-to-market is really, playing offense and thinking forward, while revenue is actually a byproduct of all the work that go-to-market strategy and execution does. And so, but RevOps is catchier to some degree than go-to-market ops. So it could be as shallow as a syntactical difference.
Okay, yeah, I'm hearing that product is not typically rolled up to RevOps, even though there should be a better feedback loop between the product and the RevOps teams.
Yeah, I wouldn't include like product and engineering under RevOps, but the interface, right? Like how do we provide feedback back to product? How do we work with product to align with their timeline so that we can plan all the go-to-market releases, right? Like what is our messaging? What's our positioning? How do we have our sales reps discuss and position our tool in the best light possible? Working very closely with our product peers.
Would you say then that GTM ops typically has a little bit more of a connection with the CSM team, or would you say with RevOps it's CSM, sales, marketing all kind of feel aligned?
I would say all of it, but depends on the maturity of the company. So early stage companies tend to have decentralized revenue operations as a design choice for the org. So what I mean by that is you have marketing ops reporting to the head of marketing. You had sales operations reporting to the head of sales and so forth. The trade-off that you have there is that you maximize for speed and alignment with your go-to-market leader. So marketing lead, the leadership can, release their campaigns in a faster fashion than if they had to business partner with a centralized RevOps team where everyone reports to a VP of revenue operations and their team directly reports to him or her. And then they work separate from, marketing or sales.
I'm going to jump ahead actually and talk a little bit about what you just said because you'd written a piece on RevOps governance and who RevOps should report to. You laid out, the CRO, the CFO, and the COO. I'd love to hear more about that. I think at one point, you didn't go into this in your essay, but at one point, you'd also laid out GTM Ops being a function that RevOps might roll up to. So I'm curious to hear more about how you see all that governance structures.
Well, I think you'd have one choice. You could either call it go-to-market operations or revenue operations. And again, we talk about maybe the philosophy of who that supports and reports to. Um, Revenue operations for early stage companies tends to be single-threaded and decentralized. These single-threaded meaning that they're working on foundational problems of the business, particularly data and systems.
Mhm.
Once you move up what I call the maturity curve, you're starting to tackle one, the alignment issue across the business. Once you solve the alignment issue, then hopefully you're providing proactive insights to the business. And then from there, you're also a business leader. But that chasm between that stage three and stage four can be very large. We see this all the time. You have marketing leaders who you bring in for a certain stage of company, and then you bring in another down the road because they haven't necessarily seen what needs to be done at each particular stage. So when it comes to revenue operations, it's very similar. So you might have someone more technical, tactical, running through walls to get all the pipes, put together essentially. And then the silos is someone a little bit more executive in their presence. They're able to speak to a head of marketing, a head of sales, really align them towards a common North Star, even though they may have separate ways to achieve that North Star, they have to work together. And then beyond that, you're starting to think through, okay, well, now it's someone maybe less hands-on keyboard and they're really thinking bigger picture and in a longer time frame. And so, as you move to each of these different phases of revenue ops, you probably have fundamentally have a very different type of leader.
So you start with a more technical person who's focused on firefighting, and as you move up the stages, it becomes more strategic.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
it sounds like you've typically been brought in when there's already a RevOps function that's clearly defined, like in stage 3 or stage 4. Is that correct?
So the last couple of years I've done a little bit of both, right? So sometimes I'm brought in and I'm the only person there, and they might have a hodgepodge of contractors. They might have someone in finance. They might have someone in biz ops taking some of the responsibility. And my goal is to start, putting a roadmap together on how they can get from here as, single team of one to a team where they need to scale and position themselves for more success on either sales productivity, diversity of marketing, campaign execution, customer success, needing to move from reactive to proactive. These are like telltale signs that are probably very helpful to bring in someone like me. And then I've also come in where I've inherited a team. The team typically consists of maybe one individual in each decentralized function. So one marketing ops, one sales ops, one CS ops. Maybe they don't have CS ops. I often see the CS team gets very little to no attention, and they're borrowing part-time, time from their sales operations peer. So that's typically when you bring me in, it's like a series B to D operator. I'm not your C to series A operator, coming in from the jump. And then, at the more mature companies, I have worked in those sectors. But for me, from an interest perspective, your role is it's very impactful because everything you do operates at a much larger scale. It's a much larger business, but your role is much more specialized.
Okay, that makes sense. And you also do consulting. What is typically the function that you're being brought in for with consulting? Is it mainly to unify the RevOps motion?
So my time is limited in terms of like moonlighting. So when it comes to consulting, I'll take on projects that are, 5 to 10 hours a week on top of, my role at Keystone. And it has to be non-competitive with my full-time work, right? But luckily, I've never had an economic consulting firm or a supply chain AI company come to me for support. But the projects tend to be fixed fee, very specialized. And oftentimes the revenue operations leader there brings me in because they need someone to help be a second set of, hands or second pair of eyes to do some work. So for example, I worked with the sports recreation software company, and they needed someone to help them build comp plans. Now, comp plan is something that their internal head of RevOps would do, but this person had, 4 or 5 major initiatives on her plate, and she just needs someone else to come in and help. So I just did a quick 6-week engagement with that firm. Sometimes folks will, oh, lately someone's brought me in. It's an industrial, I don't know exactly what they do. Some sort of industrial optimization firm. They brought me in to build AI workflows for them. So they have a keen need to bring in to raise the level of insight across the company and distill that into potential sales coaching. And so I put together an AI system and a workflow system that helps deliver those insights to them in real time, or not real time, but within a reasonable time frame.
I'd love to. Again, this is not on my list of questions, but I'm so curious. I'd love to hear more about these AI workflows that you've built. Are they mainly automation based? What are the stacks that you're connecting? You've also written a lot about this, so I'm curious.
So yeah, full disclosure, I'm a Zapier ambassador.
Yeah.
So I have been using a lot of Zapier recently. But a lot of folks have other tools at their disposal, potentially something a little bit heavier on the enterprise. But the workflow that I've done is you put together a RAG, which is retrieve, augment, and generate. But it's basically a way to connect your LLM
Hmm.
to like a data store, right? That data store serves as a knowledge repository from which is your canonical information. So you can either search and retrieve information, pretty simple search, or you can use it to interpret, some sort of open-ended query. And you use the RAG to give it a set of rules or constraints from which it can operate by. Um, so the system that I put together was a scheduled sweep of all the open opportunities in Salesforce, and it's looking for all of the previous emails and calls, and then putting them into a table, which then shows the date and time from which you had those activities,
Hmm.
and then parsing it against their own sales stage map. So, stage one through stage five. What if they have timestamps? Great. I can go through the opportunity field history table. I can see exactly when an opportunity moved between each stage. We can also assess the timing of when each activity occurred, and you can either tell if the opportunity is has great momentum or not. And then you can also check other tables that show, like the opportunity contact role, for example, just to get very technical around Salesforce. That would look at, okay, who is involved in the sales motion and how many people are in the sales motion. Do the people involved in the deal have they increased throughout the life of the deal? That's a positive signal, in my opinion. If you have someone that's marked as a champion and they have a pretty relevant title that suggests authority, it's also a very positive momentum as well.
Hmm.
And so then I will build out this knowledge repository, and then the coaching is looking at, okay, where should you be based on guidance for this time and stage and this length of the opportunity? Are you asking the right questions? And what are some suggestions to potentially improve?
What is the primary outcome of a workflow like this? Is it mainly sales managers being able to coach their reps, having better forecast views?
So one is an opportunity score, and then um, confidence level that the opportunity is on track or off track. So there's like the headline things
Mm,
that I provide, and then there's like kind of a summary saying like this opportunity is in this stage. The last few calls have suggested high momentum. We brought in these specific folks. Pricing has been discussed. It started to be narrowed. So we can start to get to the brass tacks of, okay, how can you start to close from here, right? So it's a close plan
mhm,
element. And then if there is no path to close, then it moves to secondary workflow, which is okay, well, what type of coaching would you provide to
mhm.
make sure that this goes from off track to on track?
And is that secondary workflow also a Zapier setup?
That one is not a Zapier setup, it's a competitor. So I used a different workflow. I
Oh, okay.
use a different workflow tool.
All right. But you're not allowed to name it.
Oh no, I'm not going to disclose it just for this time.
Also, full disclosure, we at Zams are building a Zapier competitor specifically for sales teams and sales
Yes.
operations. So that workflow that you just laid out, I would be remiss not to pitch our own tool for being able to do that as well.
Oh
Um,
yeah, very cool.
okay, over the years, you've written several essays about GTM tech stack, automation, build versus buy. In 2022, you had an essay where you talked about enterprise soup apps and how one-stop shops are emerging because willingness to pay is starting to hit a wall. In 2024, you talk about modular stack assessment and vendor scoring. How, especially, we have your Zapier ambassador. How are you thinking about consolidation now in 2025? Are you, based on all of the conversations you've had with different people within RevOps, are you seeing a different appetite for buying these days?
So I'm seeing a mixed bag of things, right? So with some of these AI companies that are growing so fast, I see very little spendthriftiness. In fact, they're expanding the tools that they have available to them. In the go-to-market space, we're at an interesting time where the cost of building software appears to be going down, and the speed of getting out a minimum viable product has increased. Um, and so in every category of GTM, I'm seeing more and more competitors, right? So if we used N as a variable to determine number of entrants in specific spaces, I'm seeing N go up. That makes it very difficult because when I speak to my peers who work at some of those companies, the number one issue that they have is pipeline. And the reason pipeline is such an issue is because if you don't have pipeline, you're not going to have deals. But if the number of firms goes up, the pipeline that is potentially available actually gets diffused across all these different firms. So, which I think is really, it's an interesting time to be a revenue operator because there are so many choices. But for the more mature operator who has a lower risk profile, like they're just not allowed to take a flyer on some of these newer firms. They're still going to these tried and true companies. And in fact, the tried and true companies, what they're doing is they're bulking up. And that was the concept of the super app. And bulking up is, essentially doing a roll up. So you're acquiring all these firms, you're stitching on the demand, and you're creating a customer base from which you could potentially cross sell. Now, as a revenue operator, it can be very frustrating because you want a seamless experience across these tools. Why would I buy one tool if it's a very patchwork, if not difficult integration to another tool? And that's where an iPaaS solution could be very helpful to integrate across these different solutions. Um, and so I'm seeing the interest of one, maintaining cost for some of these pipeline starved companies,
Mm,
and then on top of that, a mandate to go put in AI because AI is potentially going to cut costs out of the bottom while also increasing productivity at the top, right? It's this magic bullet that a lot of folks are asking for. And quite frankly, a lot of folks like me, we don't know what we're doing with AI, so we have to figure it all out now. This is all
mhm,
very new. Um, and so we're bringing in tools around that, fit like glue across these different tools to potentially reach out to these, incorporate these LLM models, right? So, these automation, these iPaaS solutions, adding MCP to your LLM or into the workflow steps, debating if a workflow, an automation workflow, or agentic experience makes sense. Like we're all kind of figuring this out. It's almost like new price discovery on
mhm.
what's going to work and what's not.
Right, because how are you thinking about measuring ROI on all of these different automations and AI implementations?
So I'm not sure. I can't speak for the CFO. I think the CFO is looking at FTE, ARR divided by FTE.
Mm,
Presumably, you could throw ICE on, headcount growth as a metric, and instead you say, well, let's hold headcount flat and let's see if we can't increase the number of outputs per, number of widgets per person, right? For salespeople, it would be ARR per sales rep. I would look at maybe the cost savings and the
right.
labor savings side a little bit more. I think is more tangible. And what that looks like is how many hours are you spending on activities that are not necessarily adding value? And the reason you're doing that is because it's a highly manual process, and we want to automate those processes. If we can automate those processes and then maybe shift, what processes could be automated in the future. So some of the more nebulous tasks that could not be well automated, well, you can now automate some of those actually, because now you can bring in an LLM to be a reasoning engine and make a very strong judgment call on, what the right course of action is for that specific task. So we up level the type of task that could be automated. And that actually, in theory, should then say, well, we're carving that time back to the sales rep. But here's the thing. What if, because we're saving you time, and you know that what used to take you 10 hours only takes you 4 now, and instead of starting at the 0 hour, you're starting at the 6th hour because you know you'll have 4 hours left to fix it. So you have 6 hours of, I don't know what they're doing. So the question is, okay, do we increase procrastination or late starting point because now we can start a little bit later? So it's a chicken and egg thing.
Yeah, because like the main benefit that everyone talks about when they're thinking about sales automations is the idea of, giving your reps time back to sell. Most reps are only spending about 30% of their time selling. What you're seeming to say is that even if you were to give those reps time back, there's no guarantee that it's just not going to be wasted time.
Yeah, I'm not gonna say people are like, sitting at the beach or anything, but it does make you wonder, okay, well, how do you actually force redeployment of value of that time, right? Because you do have to redeploy that time somewhere else. There's also maybe a compression, which is okay. Well, here's the awkward thing. Maybe we don't need the 10 sales reps, and this is where the dam does break. You move it from 10 reps to 7 reps.
Mm.
You've compressed your sales capacity by 30% now, but the sales capacity could be more productive because in theory, you're no longer needing to do all these manual things like building an account plan from scratch, calling, listening to every gong call for lookalike calls and developing like a script or a play that looks similar to what we did before that was successful. Like all that manual research that would take you time, you could potentially ask in natural language into some sort of interface. That interface then assesses based on the body of knowledge within the business and potentially externally and brings you best practices and then for you to execute.
Yeah, well, so you mentioned pipeline as one of the biggest issues for people that you've been speaking to. And when you say that, I'm curious if the specific automation categories that you're thinking about and what are table stakes, because it feels like if pipeline is the main issue, then a lot of that AI implementation is coming in tools like Clay with lead enrichment and prospecting. Is that what you would consider table stakes?
Well, I think you have to work with data no matter what. And working in data comes in different forms. So there's a series of steps. One, gathering data. Two, deduping the data. Deduping is a huge saver on the back end for like credits and costs.
Mhm.
Um, in time, right? Because these tools they move from left to right, north to south, row by row. And any compression on your database would, you don't want 10 million rows of bad data. You better have, a million rows of good data. Um, then there's the enrichment components. Now, the thing is, no matter how you're gathering the data isn't always going to be in alignment. So normalization is a very important thing as well. And these are business practices that have been around for decades, right? So the data refining the data and turning it into something useful, the steps have not necessarily changed. The enrichment piece is interesting because now you can go beyond surface level data enrichment and you can also somewhat enrich the data yourself, right? So before you'd have to enrich by either bringing in a research team, collecting the data, purchasing a third-party data solution. But now you can go out and crawl the web, you can parse the web, you can put it through an LLM, and you can distill it according to a data dictionary that you've built. And you could, in theory, have a very clean data set that you didn't necessarily need to rely on a third-party tool.
Yeah, that makes sense. That also feels like the highest ROI because if you're having better leads, then in general, that pipeline is the top of funnel of the pipeline is being enriched.
Yeah. I mean, well, data is a powerful thing, right? So data can tell you potentially what is the buyer, or why would the buyer potentially want to come to you before they even knew who you were, right? So we call those signals, right? A signal.
Right.
So, for example, a leader just took a new job at a new company. You know that that leader is very transformational in their approach. So, potentially, when they're coming in, they're probably looking to have some sort of shakeup within how they work. Now, the problem that they're solving for, you're not necessarily aware exactly unless you can find other signals. And what you can do from there is you can start to create a playbook and playbooks used to be pre-canned. If you see the signal, then do this. But now you can create even more playbooks. AI allows you to create a more playbooks than ever before. And maybe if you tune your AI pretty cleanly, it can then say, well, based on the data that I'm seeing, here's a hypothesis on how you could approach it based
Mhm.
on your value proposition. And based on that, you can then create a tailored messaging and you go beyond what sequences were doing before. Sequences are, canned messages and emails and calls that we wrote. We stick them in a sequence and you go one, two, three, four, five, six, and then you pay it by numbers. But now you can say, well, every single one could be a custom offer.
Mhm. Yeah, that's definitely been really interesting. We've been playing around with signal-based outbound as well, and all of the tools that are available are just phenomenal. I'm curious, at Keystone, what are the tool you don't have to say, but like as you're thinking about the tools that you're assessing, do they fall into specific buckets right now?
So we have a very limited TAM, right, at Keystone AI. So we know who we're reaching out to ahead of time. So the playbook that we're developing at Keystone, I wouldn't say is at cutting edge. So we write every email by hand still, and the research is fairly intensive because we're only reaching out to the Fortune 100.
Mhm.
Um, I think a better example would be some of my clients who have a much larger TAM. So there are some conditional factors that I think would allow you to, want to, dip your toe at the cutting edge. Um, if you're selling into a vertical with a deep TAM, I think that's a pretty good one. Um, so, for example, Jordan Crawford and his cannabology TM, he always has really interesting use cases. Like, hey, you're a plumber and you need to like work on these specific type of problems. Well, let's go look for apartment building or commercial owners who have these type of real estate, and you have access to a specific type of database and properties. That's really compelling. You can build a pretty cool use case for that. Um, so. I would think you'd have to be thoughtful around when and where you could apply these tools.
That's actually a really interesting point too around the rise of GTM engineering. Do you see it as a fad, which seems to be some people in the space feel this way, especially as, like Clay was kind of the rise of GTM engineering, and now all of Clay's sculptor tools kind of remove the need for a GTM engineer. How are you thinking about that?
I think it's brilliant. One, it's brilliant marketing, but it's not just marketing, right? So one, I want to give credit to Clay for coming up with the term and having it stick.
Yeah.
Revenue operations took years for it to stick. GTM engineering took 18 months or less to get it to stick. So credit to their team. I do find value in it, right? So, for example, the very first thing, and most people think that clay is an enrichment solution. It's very powerful at that. So, like, I want to give them credit for that. But it's not only that. But let's just go with that enrichment. The thing about enrichment is you start with raw data, first name, last name, email coming through form, and then you enrich it from there. That's powerful. And the reason you do that is because the fewer fields on a form, the higher your form fill rate will be. So
Mm.
when you fill out, that way you increase the number that percentage of form fill divided by website visitors, that goes up. And use a lot of companies have like a 1% fill rate. And then maybe I don't know what the percent completion rate is. They'll go in the form and they'll abandon it. So if you fill out the form with very little information, you have a higher volume of leads, and then you have to enrich it, score it, and then determine if you should send it to your sales team. If you don't have any leads, you should just call everybody. But like Zoom, for example, during COVID, they had bananas volume, but apparently they talked to every single lead. Um, so they don't narrow their ICP and persona. They just talk to everybody. That's a pretty incredible thing. But most firms don't do that. They'll filter, right? Is this ICP? If it's ICP, is it tier one, tier two, tier three? If it's tier one, tier two, tier three, let's look at the persona, if it's a good fit. So you're basically taking the lead from a wide funnel to a very narrow funnel. Um, and then with Clay, with GTM engineering, you're able to do something that you couldn't do before. You have to have sales enablement or some sort of copywriter write the messaging, stick it into a sequencing tool, and then you have the sales reps, pay by numbers. But with Clay, you could instead customize the offer, the sequencing, the messaging. You could also score on not surface level data. You could score on deeper level data because you're going out into the world and getting different data points via their Collegian. Um, and then from there, the ratio of SDRs to AEs can go up. So before it used to be, three AEs for every one SDR. Well, what if you have really highly personalized pieces of information for your email touches, and then you have a parallel dialer to increase the number of touches on the calling side, and you have a very strong script prepared for you if you were able to connect. You could, in theory, raise the number of meetings per SDR, meaning you wouldn't need fewer SDRs. And then you have this one central go-to-market engineer instrumenting all that data and then sending it out as prep to, the SDRs that you do have. And now they're supporting, five or six AEs instead, or maybe they're supporting even more than that. And therefore, you could have a smaller SDR org.
I wanted to, well, there are more questions that I have around automation and GTM stack and stuff like that. In a recent piece from May, you write that much of the GTM stack, especially for enterprise sales, have not kept up with the pace of buyers. And then you talk about how the system changes that need to be made to start thinking about buying groups versus MQLs. You were proposing this new idea of buying groups, but this idea of buying groups, are these changes effectively compensations for what a more evolved tech stack would solve for?
So a buying group is a construct that I received from Evan Liang, CEO and founder of Lean Data. And it's basically a word to think about buying committees. So when you go to an SMB, the champion you're selling into is probably the decision maker. So the sales cycle should be shorter, should be 30 days or less. And you're probably buying like a 500 MRR product, they're spending 6K out the door per year. But once you get into the, 30K, right? Like the lower end of the mid market, you still have like some sort of executive plus the CFO. So it's maybe like two signatories to the contract. You move up, the size of the deal tends to have a linear effect, not an exponential effect, but a linear effect on the number of decision makers. And so decision makers, if you remember this in Challenger Sale, they said there were like I think 11 folks involved in the buying cycle. And that's a lot of competing opinions. Folks have different priorities going on within the business. It's a very hard needle to thread for one singular purchase. And so, how do you align all of those interests to align towards your goal, which is obviously to have them sign up as a customer. That's classic enterprise selling, and I see that buying groups increased as you went down the size of the company, and that was because of reticence to buy new software. Right, we needed to be very thoughtful if we did make a purchase, which software would we purchase instead. And so companies are making that trade-off. Well, I want fewer pieces of software in my stack. That means I want them to do more. And that's the super app conversation again. Um, and so buying groups are something that you could identify earlier in your sales motion, right? We put the pressure on the sales reps to go figure all that out. But now with AI and thoughtful enablement, maybe you can actually get there a little bit faster. Maybe run a better discovery, and that's not necessarily AI that does that. That's still just classic great selling. And then how do you identify, is their decision process? So if we think about like medic or medpick, one of the things, the two Ds, decision criteria, decision process, two very important motions within the sales process itself. Can you surface those as early as possible and then prepare your buyer to be thoughtful around how to buy? Because you might have a champion who doesn't know how their software is purchased in their company. They could be a first-time software buyer. And so now they have to, oh, I have to bring in finance. I have to bring in legal.
Hmm.
I have to bring in, product or marketing because there's upstream and downstream impact to this tool. Maybe I have to talk to my business systems team because I have to get on their roadmap. They don't have the bandwidth to implement another tool. So, just these things when you think about buying groups, like how do you surface this information earlier?
So, am I right in saying that that specific piece and how you were thinking about it is specifically for people selling to enterprise sales teams, or is it specifically about people selling GTM software?
It's more about um, surfacing complicated buying decisions earlier, right? And um, larger firms are not the only ones engaging in complex buying behavior. In fact, smaller companies are, and that's the whole point of that article.
Okay, I thank you for clarifying that. That was a really interesting article to read. I have a lot of different levels of depth in these questions, so I want to kind of zoom back out and ask you a little bit about how you started RevOps Impact. I think there are a couple things. One is that with RevOps Impact, it's obviously to some extent a funnel into the courses that you teach, and I have questions about that. I'm curious what comes up in those courses. But also, you write it's very tactical, very technical, and very framework driven. Your core audience obviously are CROs and RevOps leaders. I'm curious, going back to what we spoke about a little bit earlier around the different stages of a RevOps function, do you see your essays being catered to a specific seniority of RevOps leaders?
Good question. So maybe a little bit of history. I worked at a company called Patient Pop, and I reported to Justin Welsh and Kevin Dorsey. They're two very well-known
Hmm.
LinkedIn personas. Justin's beyond LinkedIn now. He's like ascended into like X and all these other influencing. Um, and they were building what was called a personal brand. And so I thought that was very interesting and cool. And I started writing on LinkedIn because one, it validated my own thoughts and opinions, right? To have them challenged, to have them agreed upon. And so I wrote not necessarily hot takes. I don't write hot takes. I write I write things that you could screenshot and then try to do it yourself afterwards.
That's what it feels like, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm curious when you're, I'm also dropping in a new Zoom link in here. I'm
Oh,
curious
yeah.
when you're writing these things for people to apply, do you get feedback on people actually implementing these frameworks?
Oh, 100%. I get people all the time saying, "Hey, you like your newsletter that I've been reading the last year helped me get a raise, helped me get a promotion." There's like economic benefit that I think I have influence, but
It's amazing.
yeah, and I'm not what you can in economics to say rent seeking. I'm like, well, I hope I'm producing rent out there for others. In fact, I had someone reach out to me and ask me to shoot a video saying congratulations on their marriage. They're
Oh
getting
my
married.
gosh.
Yeah.
Because they were just so impressed with everything
They
that
were
you're.
just a fan of, I guess, my work and had his friend reached out to me on LinkedIn. Was like, my friend would really love to have a video from you. He thinks you're one of his heroes. I was like, what the heck? Okay.
That's amazing. You should be starting a cameo at this point.
That is so funny. It's like I heard this joke, or I don't know where I got the joke. It's like being the most It's like being a celebrity at a career fair. Like, can that be a thing? Like, it doesn't seem like a real thing. But okay, so I started the personal brand back in 2019, writing on LinkedIn. I saw the follower count grow, and I thought that was honestly like a game. I was like, this is cool. Like maybe I'll just optimize for this a little bit. So I started writing, and at that time, it was just myself and another woman named Rosalind Santa Elena, also like a very
Right.
well-known person in the space. And it felt like just us two talking about this random thing called revenue operations. And then COVID happened, and then I don't know what happened, but folks changed their social networking habits onto LinkedIn. It's like they were tired of Instagram, and we were all in house. So it's like, okay, well, we still want a professional connection, and the easiest way to do that is LinkedIn and my workplace. So I saw my follower count grow tremendously during that time. I had a book that I was writing about revenue operations, and instead of releasing a self-published book, I chopped it up into courses,
Oh,
and so I worked with Matt Volm, the leader, founder of RevOps Co-op,
mm.
and he and I just struck a deal. I said, "Hey, look, I have this course that I've been sitting on, but I don't really have a great distribution point. I would love to work with you." And so we did an exclusive where he has the ability to distribute my course, and the rev share from that was insane. Like we started pricing the course at a pretty high price point. I think it was like $1,800 or $2,000. It's like not a cheap course, and we were selling out. Like for 4 quarters, we did extremely well, and the extra income like helped me because at that time I was looking to buy a house. So it was really interesting to actually generate side income
Yeah.
like from my profession. And still today, I teach that course. A lot of the lessons are tried and true for today's revenue operators. And then that led into I tried creating a Patreon. I like could not stay consistent. I could not stay consistent with it. And so I shifted to Substack and I sat on the Substack for years, like from 2021 to 2020, or yeah, for about a full year, I didn't do anything on Substack. I migrated my Patreon list over to Substack, and then I just started writing. I started writing, and Substack released their find like authors feature, and then I saw basically exponential growth in my newsletter as well. So I wrote in the newsletter for a good 2 years before I asked folks to be willing to do a paywall, right? I was really sheepish about it, but we're at 5,000 subs today, gross 100 a month, predictably net net. I publish on a twice a week cadence now, Thursday and Saturdays. The Thursday is a recap of a podcast that in partnership with Cognism. They reached out to me and I'm their host of their podcast. We also talk about like get real revenue operations. Like you listen to the RevOps podcast, like there's that tactical takeaways in addition to the thought leadership. So yeah, so those three things combined, there's a bit of a workload to it, right? Like 2 hours a week for the newsletter, about an hour and a half a week for the podcast, and then the LinkedIn post. I still put in about 15, 20 minutes a day to create a post. And I try not to get stuck with writer's block. It's just like, look, like I know these are all these different things within revenue operations. I'm going to pick this topic and I'm just going to write a post about that topic very quickly.
Okay, that was going to be my next question is
Oh, okay.
what the process was. So when you say the Cognizant podcast, you mean the podcast that is published natively to your Substack?
So the podcast is owned by Cognism. I have the rights to distribute it.
Mhm.
So I distribute it through my Substack, and only my Substack actually. So it's their like thought leadership, the top of funnel play. And I unfortunately don't get to see the numbers of the performance of the podcast. I just hope that it's doing well. But the great thing is I get to bring on guests, peers of mine, and they work in a variety of different industries, variety of different countries, variety of different stages. I get to see a lot of it, which is really cool. And in the course of those conversations, we'll usually book an hour. First 10, 15 minutes, I'm just catching up with the guests, getting to know them or getting to know them. We sketch an episode out and then we record for 25, 30 minutes. And the reason I do that is because revenue operators are so busy.
Mm.
They don't want to go through the traditional marketing spiel, like, okay, let's do a prep call, then let's like let's massage the script, and then let's record, and then let's do a post recap. It's like, no, revenue
Gotta fit
operations
it all
folks do
in one
not have that
day.
type of time.
Yeah, you also mentioned that you source the podcast guests yourself. What
Yes,
are you using anything like Clay to source the guests right now?
you guessed it. Yeah, I built a clay table. I actually published the table on LinkedIn a couple of weeks
Oh,
ago.
yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
actually, I did
I
read
was
that.
using their sculpt feature. I'm like, oh, this is much better than I was doing. So, so I built
Uh,
a table with the sculpt feature. Um, hashtag not getting paid by Clay to say this. Then I reach out to them. I have them moved into a sequencing tool, which integrates with a social network that I use. I will not say it so I don't get banned. And then it reaches out on my behalf to its potential guest.
okay. And do you feel like you've talked to so many people at this point? Do you feel like you could bucket the takeaways that you've heard in different ways? And also, do you feel like the takeaways depend on the role of the person that you're speaking to?
I find the takeaways are very unique and idiosyncratic to the person speaking
Mm.
their experiences. It actually is usually like a keystone um, to their own success, and everyone's path to success in their own way is very different. It's a very unique and personal thing.
Do you feel like there was something that was particularly surprising about a sudden guess you had?
Some folks are very like technical, like they'll offer like a technical piece of advice. And some folks are more like philosophical and much more mental about it. Which is really cool. It's like, program your mindset. The other person is like, go get this hard skill set. That's how you should start. I'm like, well, it's very practical versus like, you know, life advice, right? So it's very interesting.
Okay. I'm surprised to hear that. I haven't dug deep into your podcast because mainly I was reading all your essays. But my assumption had been that they were more high level and more strategic about the space itself. So now I get to dive all into all of those.
Well, I interview a bunch of folks. I'll interview consultants who run a one-person fractional business. I'll interview a VP at a publicly traded company. I'll interview a head of RevOps team of one at a Series B startup, right? So, I get a chance to talk to like a lot of different folks. And the great thing about the podcast is it's not me telling the story, right? It's the guest. Um, And the podcast is all about the guest. It's not about me.
That is, I think, the benefit of having a podcast is just being able to hear about really interesting people. Okay, there's a piece, and now it makes sense. The earlier pieces that you wrote in 2021, I can see what you mean by you were sitting on it, where it was like very early ideations of what seems like your later pieces. But you had one which I thought was really interesting. You had a piece about how sales feels stuck in the dark ages, that career progression is like an apprenticeship model, and that you find that as a revenue leader an inefficient method of developing core talent. Then you compare it to lawyers going to law school, engineers going to engineering school. What is your updated thesis on this?
Sales is still an apprenticeship model, right? Who's the mentor? Maybe that can change, right? But I find that the best sellers are extremely good at their craft, and they get good at their craft by honing and developing those skills over time. Some are naturals, obviously, like charisma and personality does help. But you'd be surprised how many like introverts and good listeners are actually better sellers than the person who can speak well. So, in the course of the makeup of a good seller, there are probably some common themes. Coachability, they're empathetic. They know when to let a bad deal go and let it ripen until it turns into a good deal, and they'll come back. Even if they choose someone else, they may come back, right? In fact, they probably will. Um, so, I find that some interesting things about these sellers. Pressure tactics aren't like a tool that you always use.
Mm.
You use it sparingly, if maybe ever. You use, gives and gets, and you're very thoughtful around like, okay, well, I'm giving you something, I'd like to get something in return, but it's not necessarily a transactional relationship, even though it is a transaction at the end of the day. So, these are very interesting things that I've seen. And the apprenticeship model is because if you're a seller and you're managed by a sales manager who's not particularly effective at coaching and teaching, then you're by definition stifled, right?
Yeah.
You have to go seek external mentors, so you could sail around it, but it is about like sometimes did you have the right leadership that you were tutored under?
Yeah, that was a surprising thing as I've become more inundated into the sales ecosystem of seeing how many early career sellers have these different mentors and coaches outside of their company. I'm assuming there must be some privacy concerns there about how you record calls and things like that, but it is interesting.
I mean, there are sellers who pay for their own enrichment tool on the side, right? It's like, the tool that Jeff gave me, set the corporate sponsor tool doesn't give me the right data all the time. So I need to buy out of pocket, like my own tool, right? It's kind of like the teachers who pay for pencils and paper for their students. A lot of sellers, they do the same thing. You'll be very surprised.
Do you feel like if there was to be a more structured education system around selling and just RevOps and revenue teams in general, what would that system look like?
To me, it's tough because not every business at every stage can afford to bring in all those resources, right? Bring in a sales enablement leader, bring in a sales manager who's hits all the elements that CEOs and VPs, are looking for. It is very hard to nail that leadership hire, but I do think it's very important that you do nail it correctly. Um, so you could go through an experience where it's a share, the cost of development is split and shared. You can go to a third party external organization that trains your sellers. Just make sure that experience makes a ton of sense for the type of buying experience that your buyers expect. Um, so you could go through like these different sales academies. You could bring in a sales trainer, and what you're doing there is you're shortcutting, the training to get to where they need to go. Now the thing is, every business expects like sales training to be customized,
Mm.
right, for their particular environment. But it does always take time for that sales coach to also, get ramped. They don't know your industry inside and out. They don't know your persona inside and out. They're abstracting it to a much higher like level. Okay, well, they're humans and they work for organizations, and these widgets unlock some sort of widgetized ROI, and then you'll fill in the gaps like Mad Libs down the road.
Okay, that's so interesting to hear. because now it gives me more insight into how tools like Gong are essentially monopolizing the education space to some extent in the sales ecosystem.
Well, Gong is incredible, right? Like they build their own tools. Right? We talked about the super apps, these roll-ups. You're buying companies. Gong's not doing that. Gong is building one thing at a time, and a lot of folks are belly aching how slow they are now on their innovation. But what they have out there is really good for what they do. In fact, probably cream of the crop, right? Like natural language translation, parsing, and insights. Pretty good at that without the AI. And now they feel a little bit behind because this like huge capability came out, but they'll catch up. I trust they will. They added forecasting as a solution because
Huge capability being external to Gong.
I think a lot of folks thought that with AI coming in, it would raise the tides of all the other competitors to be able to
Oh,
catch up parity-wise with Gong. But Gong has a very sticky like UI, right? You can't discount UX, UI. It has really great coaching and backend, like something that my one of my go-to sales enablement leaders, he and I will work on. Um, an onboarding program, right? Whenever we get a chance to roll one out, we'll always snippet the very best calls nominated by the reps,
mm,
and we'll put that in a track. Like, here's as a new rep in your first 30 days, you should be listening to these calls. Why? Because this is a very well executed objection handle, very well executed elevator pitch.
mhm.
Here's how they repositioned or did a pattern interruption, like a lot of these sales terminologies that you hear. And so we'll put together like a collection of the greatest hits, and not only that, Gong is very good at surfacing like certain metrics that make sense. Is this person talking too much versus this person? Are they asking open-ended questions? Like, simple sales tips and practices that you coach your reps, but you couldn't necessarily measure before.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they've rebranded as like a full revenue operating system, revenue intelligence system, and they are just sitting on so much ghost knowledge. All of that domain expertise in those calls is just so phenomenal. Okay, in another essay back in 2020, you talk about how RevOps will kill sales ops, and specifically how revenue generators are getting to divide and conquer, and ops is left to consolidate and liberate, like marketing gets to break out into paid versus direct, but sales planning and sales analysts are kind of rolled up into sales ops. This feels very, very true today. Are you seeing different trends coming out of AI as, like sales analysts being less of a priority because AI tools can do these things?
I think today the revenue operator has been embraced by B2B SaaS. I'd be very hard pressed to find a company that doesn't bring in some sort of revenue operations capability early. And I think a lot of folks have wisened up on that. I do think maybe we as a profession have oversold what revenue operations can do,
Oh.
because I find that a lot of revenue operators are burned out now, right? So the amount of responsibilities, levied at their feet is fairly wide, right? It spans FinOps, BizOps sometimes, and it's not just RevOps. It's a lot. And so I find a lot of folks they wanted to get in because they wanted to take on a generalist role supporting the revenue function. We're doing that, but we're also doing quite a bit, and the experience has been sometimes more than we can chew. And there is a pretty high level of burnout. And our tenures are short, just like a CRO, right? I don't have the data, but you'll see a lot of folks, including myself, who have like a year or under 2 years of experience because the leadership you came in with, they're out the door. So technically, you go out the door with them as well a lot of the times.
Oh,
So
that's
so it's pretty interesting. So I'm curious if you know where we'll come out on the other side of this. I know some folks wanted to get in. It is a very difficult profession. And it is a bit of a apprenticeship model as well, right? So if you go in a company and don't have someone there to teach you the ropes, hopefully they'll come and learn from folks like me or from other folks who have their own courses. But at the end of the day, it's a very challenging time for revenue operators, but also exciting because now we're asked to do a bunch of AI stuff.
yeah.
And I find that a lot of us are now going back into a lot of these automation tools and blowing the dust off it and say, okay, well, now we can do some pretty cool things with these. I want to start dabbling again.
Ah, blowing the dust off it, as in like back in 2015, having picked them up briefly and then coming back now, 10 years later.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of us built our workflows in the tools themselves, right? You built Salesforce flows or HubSpot workflows, but you still, the glue between the two, we handled them point to point within the apps, right? Many times. But now you're like, okay, well, now I can start to orchestrate across multiple apps. And I'm seeing a lot of folks re-embrace some of these like integration tools that go across all the tools.
That makes sense. And the stat that I've heard on CRO tenureship is about 18 months. So I assume
That's the one
with
I hear too.
RevOps, it's
And getting shorter, according to Sam Jacobs at Pavilion.
oh, great. Love that. Well, Jeff, I know we're at time, and thank you so much for taking the time to chat. It was really lovely to get all of your insight. Typically at this point, I say, do you have anything to say to LinkedIn? But we are not on LinkedIn. So do you have anything to say to YouTube?
Um, I would say be curious and don't feel threatened or fearful this time. In fact, for those who embrace these newer technologies and use it, every day in some capacity, I think you'll find a tremendous productivity unlock. And I wish the best for everyone.
Lovely message to end on. All